Chapter 1. Shadows of the Past. The archives smelled of old paper and time, a peculiar blend of aged ink, brittle parchment, and the faint, unplaceable scent of forgotten stories. Alara's footsteps echoed softly against the tiled floor as she made her way to her desk, a solitary island surrounded by an ocean of meticulously labeled boxes and shelves. This was her sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the outside world could not intrude. Here, she could lose herself in the whispers of history, finding solace in the order of cataloging lives long past. The morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting elongated patterns on the floor. Alara's movements were methodical, each action precise as she prepared for another day. She adjusted her glasses, ran a hand through her chestnut hair, and settled into her chair with a cup of lukewarm tea. Today, she was to begin the inventory of a new collection, letters and photographs from the early 20th century. The work was quiet, consuming, and exactly what she needed. But then, the door creaked open. Alara glanced up, expecting to see her supervisor, or perhaps the janitor making his rounds. Instead, a figure lingered in the doorway. He was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, with a tousle of dark hair and a slightly awkward posture. His eyes, bright and curious, met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stutter. "Hi," he said, stepping inside. His voice was warm, tinged with a note of hesitation. "I'm Jasper, the new intern." Alara felt a chill run down her spine. Something about him was familiar. She couldn't place it, but there was a striking resemblance to someone she had tried for years not to think about. Dismissing the thought, she straightened her posture and managed a polite smile. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady but distant. "I'm Alara. You'll be working here for the summer?" He nodded, stepping further into the room. "Yeah, I've always been fascinated by history, and this place, well, it's incredible. Like stepping back in time." His enthusiasm was genuine, almost infectious. Alara forced a small smile and gestured to an empty desk nearby. "That will be your station. I'll show you the ropes." As she walked him through the basics of the archive's cataloging system, her unease grew. It wasn't just his appearance that unsettled her. It was his mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when listening, the faint hint of a smile that played at the corners of his lips. They were all eerily reminiscent of someone she had known long ago, someone she had lost. When the introduction was over, Jasper settled into his desk with the eager energy of someone ready to dive in. Alara returned to her own work, but her focus had fractured. She found herself glancing at him occasionally, studying his profile as he sorted through a box of old letters. Her heart tightened when he began to hum, a soft, melancholic tune that tugged at the edges of her memory. She clenched her hands beneath the desk, willing herself to concentrate. It was absurd, she thought. People resembled others all the time. It was mere coincidence. And yet, the feeling gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. By lunchtime, Alara's nerves were frayed. She left the archives and stepped into the courtyard, seeking refuge in the crisp autumn air. She leaned against a stone bench, closing her eyes and taking deep breaths. Memories threatened to surface, flashes of a summer long ago when laughter had filled her days and love had seemed eternal. She shook her head, banishing the images. That part of her life was over. It had to be. When she returned, Jasper was waiting at her desk. He held a photograph in his hand, his expression a mix of curiosity and something she couldn't quite decipher. "I found this in one of the boxes," he said, handing it to her. Alara's breath caught. It was an old photograph, faded but still clear enough to make out the faces. A young couple stood beneath a tree, their smiles wide, their hands intertwined. The woman in the picture was her, years younger, carefree, and radiant with happiness. The man beside her, she stared at the image, her heart pounding. The man in the photograph was unmistakably Jasper. "Is something wrong?" Jasper asked, his brow furrowing. Alara's hands trembled as she placed the photograph face down on her desk. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. And as she glanced at Jasper, who was watching her with a mix of concern and curiosity, she felt the weight of the past press against her chest. For the first time in years, Alara wondered if the ghost she had buried might still be alive, waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Halls. The following days unraveled like threads from an ancient tapestry, each moment weaving itself into the strange fabric of Alara's life. Jasper had settled into his role with a vigor that was almost disruptive. He moved through the archives with a restless energy, his curiosity pulling him to every corner, every dusty shelf. To Alara, his presence was both a distraction and a mirror reflecting shadows she had long tried to forget. The archives themselves seemed to respond to him. The faint creaks of the wooden floorboards, the soft rustle of papers stirred by an unseen draft. Everything felt heightened. Alara tried to ignore it, to bury herself in her work, but Jasper's questions always found her. "Do you ever wonder about the people behind these letters?" he asked one afternoon, holding up a faded envelope with looping handwriting. "What their lives were like, what their secrets were." Alara glanced up from her desk, her pen hovering over the ledger. She hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes, but it's better not to dwell. These are just fragments of their lives. Incomplete stories." Jasper tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Incomplete, maybe, but isn't that the best part? Filling in the gaps? Imagining what might have been." His words unsettled her. They reminded her of someone else, someone who had once shared that same sentiment. She turned back to her work, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension in her shoulders. But Jasper was perceptive. He seemed to sense her unease, though he never pressed. Instead, he continued to hum softly as he worked. The tune was hauntingly familiar, a melody that stirred something deep within Alara, a memory she couldn't quite grasp. One evening, as the pale light of dusk seeped through the windows, Alara found herself alone in the archives. Jasper had left for the day, his laughter echoing faintly in the hall as he said goodbye. She stood in the main hall, staring at the rows of shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dimness. The silence was oppressive, yet comforting, like an old blanket that had seen better days. She reached for a box labeled 1910 to 1920 and opened it carefully. Inside were letters tied with fraying ribbons and photographs that had faded to sepia tones. She picked up a photograph of a young couple standing in front of a house, their smiles frozen in time. The man's face was blurred, the result of years of wear, but the woman's expression was clear, hopeful, radiant, and achingly familiar. A sudden creak broke the silence, and Alara's heart leapt. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. The hall was empty, the only movement coming from the slow swaying of a single light fixture overhead. She exhaled, chiding herself for her nerves. The archives were old, full of noises that had nothing to do with ghosts. Still, as she returned the photograph to the box, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, Jasper arrived earlier than usual, his face alight with excitement. "Alara, you have to see this," he said, holding a small leather-bound book. She frowned, taking the book from him. It was a diary, its cover worn and edges frayed. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing against the yellowed pages. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Jasper's enthusiasm faltered for a moment. "In one of the boxes we were sorting yesterday. It was hidden beneath a false bottom. Weird, right?" Alara's stomach tightened. Diaries were rare finds in the archives, often too personal to be included in public collections. She scanned the first few pages, her eyes catching fragments of a life long gone. July 14th, the summer heat unbearable, met him again by the river, his smile brighter than the sun. A secret we must keep, for the world would never understand. Her hands trembled as she closed the book. It's interesting, she said carefully, but it might not be relevant to our work. Jasper raised an eyebrow. Not relevant? This is history, Alara. Real, raw history. Don't you think it deserves to be heard? She wanted to argue, to tell him that not all stories were meant to be unearthed, but the conviction in his voice stopped her. Instead, she nodded, tucking the diary into her bag. I'll look into it later. That night, Alara sat in her small apartment, the diary open on the table before her. She read each entry slowly, the words pulling her into a world that felt both foreign and familiar. The writer's voice was intimate, filled with longing and a quiet defiance. As the story unfolded, Alara felt a strange connection to the author, a woman who had loved fiercely, despite the odds. And then she came to the final entry. August 12th. If you find this, know that love is never lost. It lingers, like echoes in the halls, waiting to be found. Alara's breath hitched. The words felt like a message, not just from the past, but from something deeper. She closed the diary and stared at the flickering candle on her table. The shadows danced on the walls, their shapes shifting like memories she couldn't quite grasp. In the silence, she thought she heard it again. The faint hum of a familiar tune, carried by a voice she could no longer place. And for the first time in years, Alara wondered if she was truly alone. Chapter 3: Threads of the Unseen. The air inside the archives was unusually still, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Days had passed since Alara had discovered the diary, and yet its words lingered in her mind like the faintest echo, haunting her every thought. She had read and reread its entries, trying to discern why the author's voice felt so familiar. The story it told, of a secret love hidden from the world, struck a chord deep within her, resonating with her own buried memories. But it was the closing line that truly unsettled her. Love is never lost. It lingers, like echoes in the halls, waiting to be found. Even as she returned to her routine, filing documents and cataloging artifacts, that line played on repeat in her mind. She told herself it was just a coincidence, a poetic flourish by a writer long gone. But the rationalization did little to quiet the unease brewing in her chest. Jasper, for his part, seemed oblivious to her internal turmoil. His energy was undiminished, his curiosity as boundless as ever. He had taken to exploring the farthest reaches of the archives, often returning with some obscure item or forgotten photograph that would spark an animated discussion. If he noticed the dark circles under Alara's eyes or her tendency to drift into silence, he didn't mention it. One afternoon, as the rain pattered softly against the windows, Jasper approached her desk holding a gramophone record encased in a cracked sleeve. "Look at this," he said, his voice alight with excitement. "It's a recording from the 1930s. Do you think it still works?" Alara glanced up from her ledger. "Possibly, but it's fragile. Where did you find it?" "In one of the storage rooms at the back. There's a gramophone back there, too. Want to give it a try?" Her first instinct was to decline. She had more than enough work to occupy her time, and the thought of indulging Jasper's whims felt like a distraction she couldn't afford. But something about the record, the faded label, the handwritten title that had nearly worn away, piqued her curiosity. With a reluctant nod, she followed Jasper to the back room. The gramophone sat atop a dusty table, its brass horn tarnished but intact. Jasper carefully placed the record onto the turntable and wound the crank. his movements surprisingly delicate. When the needle touched the grooves, a crackle filled the room, followed by the faint strains of music. The melody was slow and melancholic, a haunting tune that sent a shiver down Alara's spine. As the voice of a singer joined the melody, her breath caught in her throat. The words were faint, obscured by the static of age, but the tune itself was unmistakable. It was the same melody Jasper had been humming since the day he arrived. "Do you recognize it?" Jasper asked, glancing at her. Alara shook her head, though her heart was racing. "No. It's beautiful, though. It's mesmerizing," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the spinning record. "It feels familiar somehow, doesn't it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the record, her mind racing with questions she couldn't voice. How could he know that tune? How could it have appeared here, in this forgotten relic? The coincidence was too great to ignore. That night, Alara sat at her desk at home, the diary open before her. She had retrieved it from her bag as soon as she returned, unable to resist its pull. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages, her eyes scanning the lines of text for anything she might have missed. And then she saw it. In the margins of one of the entries, scrawled in faint pencil, was a string of musical notes. It was the melody from the record. Alara's pulse quickened as she stared at the notes. They were unmistakable, matching the tune Jasper had hummed and the one that had played on the gramophone. Her mind reeled as she tried to make sense of it. Was it a coincidence? Or was there something connecting all of this? The diary, the record, and Jasper himself? The next morning, she arrived at the archives early, her resolve firm. She needed answers, and she was determined to find them. She sought out the storage room where Jasper had discovered the record, combing through its contents with meticulous care. Old newspapers, faded photographs, and stacks of documents passed through her hands, each one a potential clue. But it wasn't until she opened a small wooden box that her search bore fruit. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age but still clear. It depicted a young couple standing beneath a tree, their hands intertwined. Alara recognized the woman immediately. It was the same woman from the diary, her expression alight with a mixture of joy and defiance. But it was the man who made her stomach drop. He was the mirror image of Jasper. Alara sank to the floor, the photograph trembling in her hands. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more implausible than the last. Could Jasper be connected to this man? Was it simply a case of uncanny resemblance? Or was there something more? Something she couldn't explain? As she sat there, the faint strains of the melody seemed to echo in her ears, as though the halls themselves were whispering to her. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain. The past wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 4: Reflections in Glass. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the archives, its golden light illuminating motes of dust suspended in the still air. Alara sat at her desk, staring at the photograph she had found the previous day. It lay flat on the polished wood, the edges curling slightly, as if resisting the weight of time. Her mind raced with questions that refused to settle, each one colliding with the next like waves in a storm. The man in the photograph was undeniably Jasper. The same sharp jawline, the same tousled hair that seemed perpetually caught in a breeze. Even the way he leaned slightly toward the woman, his arm brushing hers, was achingly familiar. And yet, the photograph was decades old. The impossibility of it left her both fascinated and unnerved. She hadn't slept much the night before. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of the couple beneath the tree, their love frozen in time. And over it all, that haunting melody played, weaving itself into her dreams and waking thoughts alike. She knew she needed to confront Jasper, but the thought of doing so filled her with a strange dread. What would she even say? How could she explain what she had found without sounding utterly unhinged? Lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice Jasper's arrival until he was standing beside her desk. "Good morning, Alara," he said, his voice cheerful as always. "You're here early." She quickly slid the photograph into a drawer, her movements sharp and deliberate. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, avoiding his gaze. He tilted his head, studying her with a curious expression. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said too quickly, the words snapping like a brittle twig. She cleared her throat and forced herself to meet his eyes. "Actually, there's something I found. I wanted to ask you about it." His brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Sure. What is it?" Alara hesitated, her hand hovering over the drawer. She could feel the weight of the photograph within, its presence almost tangible. Taking a deep breath, she opened the drawer and retrieved it, placing it on the desk between them. Jasper leaned in, his expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper. He picked up the photograph, his fingers brushing its edges with care. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes scanning the image. Then he looked up, his face pale. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "In one of the storage rooms," she said. "It was in a box with some other documents. The woman in the photo is the author of the diary we found. But the man..." Jasper's gaze returned to the photograph. "The man looks like me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Alara searched his face for a sign of recognition, some indication that he knew more than he was letting on. But his expression was unreadable, a mix of confusion and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "Do you know who he is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jasper shook his head. "No. I've never seen this before." Alara's chest tightened. She had hoped for answers, but his reaction only deepened the mystery. She leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. "It doesn't make any sense," she said. "How can someone who looks exactly like you be in a photograph from decades ago?" Jasper set the photograph down and leaned against the edge of her desk. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "People say everyone has a doppelganger, right?" Alara shook her head. "This isn't just a resemblance. It's uncanny. And then there's the melody, the one you keep humming. It's the same tune that's written in the diary and the same one on the gramophone record. How do you explain that?" Jasper's eyes widened slightly. "I didn't even realize I was humming it," he admitted. "It's just something that's always been in my head. I don't know where it came from." Alara studied him, her mind racing. Was he telling the truth? Or was there more to him than he was letting on? She wanted to believe him, but the coincidences were piling up, each one more impossible than the last. "I think we need to dig deeper," she said finally. "There's something connecting all of this, the diary, the photograph, the melody. And I don't think it's just coincidence." Jasper nodded slowly. "I'll help," he said. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." The rest of the day passed in a blur of research and quiet determination. Alara and Jasper pored over the archives, searching for any clue that might shed light on the photograph or the diary. They found fragments of information, mentions of the woman from the diary, hints of a forbidden romance, but nothing concrete. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Alara sat back in her chair, exhausted but resolute. Jasper was across from her, his head bent over a stack of documents. The faint hum of the mysterious melody drifted from his lips, and Alara felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. The past was calling to her, and it would not be ignored. Chapter 5. The Tides of Memory. The archives had never felt so alive, yet so stifling. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead blended with the rhythmic scratching of Alara's pen as she combed through yet another brittle ledger. Across the desk, Jasper sat, his usual buoyancy tempered by the day's discoveries. The photograph and diary now occupied a central place in their research, each new clue deepening the labyrinth of questions rather than providing answers. The faint scent of aged paper hung in the air, mingling with the faint hum of a melody, Jasper's constant companion. Alara found herself glancing at him more often now, not out of curiosity but unease. Each time he unconsciously hummed that tune, a weight settled deeper in her chest. It wasn't just familiar. It felt like an invocation, stirring ghosts that had long slumbered. "Do you think we'll find her?" Jasper's voice broke the silence. He looked up from a stack of old correspondences, his brow furrowed. "The woman in the diary, do you think we'll uncover what happened to her?" Alara placed her pen down and rubbed her temples. "I don't know," she admitted. "She's just as much a mystery as everything else." Jasper leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. "It's strange," he mused. "I feel like I know her, like I've read her story before, or maybe heard about it in a dream." Alara's fingers tightened around her pen. "Dreams can be deceiving," she said softly, though her own were no less troubling. Each night since finding the photograph, she had dreamed of the couple beneath the tree. Their laughter, their whispered promises, the way the man, Jasper, looked at the woman with an intensity that made her heart ache. It felt real, too real, and waking up left her disoriented and yearning for answers. As the day wore on, the search turned up little of substance. Jasper, unable to sit still any longer, began to wander the archives. He sifted through boxes and shelves with an almost frantic energy, his movements a mix of frustration and curiosity. Alara watched him from a distance, feeling a pang of sympathy. Whatever this mystery was, it seemed to affect him on a level she couldn't yet understand. It was late afternoon when Jasper's voice called out from the far corner of the room. "Alara, you need to see this." Her heart leapt as she hurried toward him. He stood beside a tall shelf, holding an envelope that looked as though it had been hidden for decades. The edges were frayed, the paper brittle and stained. Alara took it from him carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a letter, written in the same elegant handwriting as the diary entries. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "My dearest, I fear our time together is slipping away faster than I ever imagined. Every moment we share feels like borrowed time, stolen from a world that seeks to keep us apart. But I promise you this. No matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, my heart will always belong to you. If you ever doubt my love, remember the tune we shared beneath the sycamore. Let it guide you back to me. Forever yours, Lenore." The final words struck Alara like a thunderclap. Her vision blurred, and she had to steady herself against the shelf. "Lenore," she whispered, the name rolling off her tongue like a forgotten prayer. Jasper was silent, his expression unreadable as he stared at the letter. Finally, he spoke. "The sycamore. That's the tree from the photograph, isn't it?" Alara nodded, her thoughts spinning. The sycamore. The melody. Lenore. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still shrouded in shadows. That evening, Alara returned home with the letter tucked safely in her bag. She couldn't bring herself to part with it, not yet. She needed time to process, to think. As she sat at her desk, staring at the letter once more, the haunting melody played in her mind. It was more than just a tune. It was a connection, a bridge between past and present. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. Rising cautiously, she opened the door to find Jasper standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "I thought maybe we could. I don't know. Talk?" About all of this? Alara hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. They settled on opposite ends of the small living room, the letter resting on the coffee table between them like an unspoken truth. "Do you believe in fate?" Jasper asked after a long silence. Alara looked at him, startled. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I used to think everything had an explanation, that every mystery could be solved if you just looked hard enough. But now, she gestured toward the letter. "Now I'm not so sure. Everything about this feels like it's meant to be. But I don't know if that's comforting or terrifying." Jasper nodded, his gaze distant. "I feel the same way. It's like there's something I'm supposed to remember, but I can't quite reach it." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Then Jasper leaned forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the letter. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." Alara wanted to believe him, but as she watched him leave later that night, the shadows between the pages of Lenore's story felt deeper than ever, and the melody lingered, an unanswered question echoing in the corners of her mind. Chapter 6: Whispers in the Archive. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, tapping against the tall windows of the archives, as if urging Alara to look out and lose herself in the storm's hypnotic chaos. But her attention remained fixed on the letter, now lying beneath a protective sheet of glass on her desk. Jasper had convinced her to preserve it properly, yet its words still felt too fragile, as though even a glance might unravel the delicate thread binding the past to the present. Jasper had arrived early that morning, his usual brightness dimmed but not extinguished. He brought coffee and a book he'd borrowed from the local library, a historical account of the town's early settlers. It seemed to be his way of coping, diving headfirst into research. Alara envied his energy, even if it masked his own unease. "Did you know this place used to be a trading post?" he said, flipping through the pages as he leaned against a desk. Apparently, it was a hub for all sorts of goods and secrets. Makes you wonder what kind of stories the walls would tell if they could talk. Alara glanced up from her work. "Sometimes I think they do." Jasper gave her a lopsided grin. "Then maybe we should start listening better." The day's search led them deeper into the archives, into sections that hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light as they sifted through boxes of yellowed documents and forgotten artifacts. Alara's hands trembled slightly when she uncovered an ornate leather-bound journal, its spine cracked with age. She handed it to Jasper, who opened it carefully. "It's dated 1911, he murmured, his fingers tracing the faded ink. "The handwriting. It looks familiar." Alara moved closer, her breath catching as she recognized the elegant script. It matched the letter. They read in silence, their curiosity giving way to awe as the journal revealed glimpses of a life steeped in longing and mystery. Lenore's voice seemed to emerge from the pages, weaving a tale of stolen moments beneath the sycamore tree, of laughter shared under star-studded skies, and of a love she feared would not survive the world's harsh judgments. "My dearest is the sun to my shadow, the breath to my lungs. Yet, even as I write this, I know we are bound by forces beyond our control. I cannot bear to lose what we have found, yet I feel the tide pulling us apart." The final entry was dated only days before the photograph had been taken. It ended abruptly, with an unfinished sentence that left both Alara and Jasper reeling. "If you find this, know that my heart." "Do you think she meant for someone to find it?" Jasper asked as they walked back to their desks. His voice was hushed, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile connection they'd unearthed. Alara shook her head. "I don't know, but it's clear she wanted to be remembered." The journal added another layer to the enigma of Lenore's life. It also deepened Alara's unease. The emotions captured in those pages felt too familiar, as though they resonated not just with her mind, but with her soul. She couldn't shake the feeling that Lenore's story was somehow hers to finish. That evening, as the rain continued to drum against the windows, Alara found herself alone in the archives. Jasper had left hours earlier, promising to return with more research materials. The quiet should have been soothing, but it felt oppressive, the shadows in the corners growing longer with each passing hour. She wandered back to the section where they had found the journal, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. Her flashlight illuminated the rows of shelves, their contents silent but watchful. She stopped when her beam caught something glinting on the floor. Bending down, she picked up a small silver locket. It was simple, unadorned except for an engraving on the back. L and J. Alara's breath hitched. She opened the locket carefully, revealing two tiny photographs inside. One was of Lenore, her smile soft and wistful. The other, she staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth. It was Jasper, or someone who looked exactly like him. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the tilt of his head and the light in his eyes. But the photograph was clearly decades old. When Jasper returned the next morning, Alara didn't wait for him to settle in. She placed the locket in his hand, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to shock. "This isn't possible," he whispered, turning the locket over in his fingers. That can't be me." "I don't think it is," Alara said. "But whoever it is, they're connected to Lenore. And to us." They stared at each other, the weight of the discovery settling heavily between them. The boundaries between past and present were blurring, and neither of them could ignore the implications. The archives, once a haven of order and logic, had become a labyrinth of mysteries that refused to stay buried. Jasper finally broke the silence. "We need to find the sycamore tree." Alara nodded. It was the next step, the next piece of the puzzle. But as they began to plan their search, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if the answers they sought weren't meant to be found? Chapter 7. The Forgotten Tune. The days blended into a fog of shadows and whispers. As I walked through the narrow corridors of the library, the smell of old paper and ink settled into the back of my mind like a constant, comforting presence. It was as if the air itself was thick with stories yet to be told, memories pressed into the corners of every shelf, waiting for someone, anyone, to pull them free. The archivist's sanctuary had always been quiet, peaceful even, but the ghostly presence of summer had changed that. The strange woman who had wandered into my life, a phantom of joy and sorrow, had become an enigma I could no longer ignore. The ethereal glow of her form was so fragile, so delicate, it seemed as though a mere breath would scatter her into dust. She was fading. I could feel it, and the thought twisted something in my chest. It had been weeks since our first encounter. Each night, Summer's voice echoed in my dreams, calling to me, urging me to dig deeper, to understand the stories buried within the archive. She told me of lost histories, of lives forgotten by time, of unspoken loves and battles fought in silence. The more I listened, the more I became consumed by the archive. I spent hours in its labyrinthine hallways, searching through dusty tomes and crumbling scrolls, looking for the key to unlock the mystery of her existence. But so far, I had found nothing. One evening, as the sun began to set and the golden light seeped through the stained glass windows, I found myself at the end of a row of ancient manuscripts. The air felt cooler than usual, and the familiar weight of silence pressed in on me from all sides. There, on the ground, lay a book I had never seen before. It was not one of the typical volumes stored here. Its leather cover worn and scratched, its pages yellowed with age. Curiosity gripped me, and I picked it up, feeling the weight of its history in my hands. The title was embossed in faded gold letters, The Chronicles of the Forgotten Ones. A chill ran down my spine. I had never heard of this book before, and yet, It seemed strangely familiar, like a lost part of me calling out. I opened the cover carefully, careful not to tear the fragile pages. As I flipped through the worn paper, the words seemed to shimmer, almost as if the book itself was alive, pulsing with some hidden energy. The ink was not the black I had come to expect, but a soft shade of deep crimson, as though written in blood. My pulse quickened, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Summer's pale face materializing from the shadows. But she wasn't there. The silence remained unbroken. The first entry caught my eye. It was dated several centuries ago, written in a language I did not recognize, but the symbols seemed oddly familiar, shapes that matched the symbols Summer had drawn in the air when we first met. I traced the edges of the symbols with my finger, and something strange happened. A shiver ran through my hand, up my arm, and settled deep within my chest. Suddenly, the archive shifted around me. The shelves seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with the scent of musty parchment, and I was no longer alone. Summer appeared in front of me, her ghostly figure bathed in a soft, otherworldly light. She looked as she always had, beautiful, wistful, and impossibly fragile. But something was different this time. She seemed more solid, more present. "You found it," she whispered, her voice like a distant echo. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. There was so much I wanted to ask, so much I needed to know. But before I could find my voice, she held up her hand to stop me. "The answers you seek are here, in this place," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "But you must be careful, archivist. The stories here are not just memories. They are alive, and they will seek to claim you if you are not careful." The warning sent a jolt of fear through me. I had always known there was something more to the archive than met the eye, but I had never fully understood the danger. Summer stepped closer, her figure flickering like a candle caught in the wind. "Do you remember what I told you? About the forgotten ones?" I nodded, though I was not sure if I truly understood. The forgotten ones, souls lost to time, swept away by the currents of history. Were they trapped here in the archive, hidden in the pages of books that had never been read? Or were they like Summer herself, lingering between worlds, waiting to be remembered? She sighed, a soft sound like the rustle of autumn leaves. "There is a story here that must be told, but it is not just any story. It is the story of my end, the story of how I came to be trapped in this place." My heart pounded in my chest. I had always known Summer was tied to the archive, but I had never dared to ask her directly what had happened to her. What had brought her here? Why did she haunt the very space I had dedicated my life to preserving? "It's a story that has been lost for centuries," Summer continued, her voice trembling. "And you are the only one who can uncover it." I felt a weight settle in my chest, as though the very air around me had thickened. The archive seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive, as if the books themselves were listening, waiting for something to happen. Summer's figure flickered again, and I could see the sadness in her eyes, the unspoken pain of a lifetime trapped in limbo. "There is more at stake here than you know," she said, her voice low and urgent. "If you fail to uncover the truth, the archive will claim you too. You will become a forgotten one, lost to time." The thought struck me with terrifying clarity. The archive was not just a collection of books and memories. It was a living, breathing entity, one that could trap souls like mine and Summer's forever. If I didn't find the truth, if I didn't unravel the mystery, I too would fade away. I closed the book, my hands trembling. Summer was gone in an instant, her presence slipping away like a shadow in the dimming light. But the weight of her words lingered, pressing on my mind like a heavy stone. The room seemed still, too still. And for the first time since I had come to the archive, I felt the true weight of the responsibility I had inherited. It was not just about preserving stories. It was about ensuring that they were told, that they did not fade into nothingness. The stories here held more than just knowledge. They held lives, and those lives needed to be remembered. I stood there for a long while, my fingers still curled around the mysterious book. The answers were within my grasp, but I had no idea where to begin. The story of the Forgotten Ones was more than just a tale. It was a warning, and if I wasn't careful, I would become one of them. Chapter 8. The Weight of Silence. The silence that followed Summer's departure was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. I remained in the archive for hours after she had vanished, the ancient book still clutched tightly in my hands. The light from the setting sun had long since faded, leaving only the cold glow of the lamps to illuminate the rows upon rows of shelves. The pages of the Chronicles of the Forgotten Ones seemed to hum with an unseen energy, as if waiting for me to make a decision. I had felt the weight of responsibility before. When I first became the archivist, I had known that I was the keeper of forgotten things. But now, it was different. The archive was no longer just a place of knowledge. It was a realm where the past and present collided, where stories were not only preserved but were alive, pulsing with the memories of those who had once walked the earth. I was not simply cataloging the past anymore. I was standing on the precipice of something far greater, something far more dangerous. I knew I had to continue my search. The answers Summer had hinted at, the ones that would explain her existence and the strange power that the archive seemed to hold, were within my reach. But where to start? The cryptic warning she had given me lingered in my mind. If you fail to uncover the truth, the archive will claim you too. You will become a forgotten one, lost to time. The words echoed in the stillness, a chilling reminder of the stakes. The archive was not just a place of preservation. It was a prison, and it could claim me just as easily as it had claimed others. I walked to the far end of the archive, where the oldest manuscripts were kept, ancient texts that were barely readable, their ink fading with time. I needed to understand what had happened to Summer and what it meant to be one of the forgotten ones. The book in my hands seemed to guide me, pulling me forward as though it too had a part to play in this unfolding mystery. The pages turned easily under my fingers, the scent of age and dust filling the air with each flip. As I read, the history of the Forgotten Ones slowly revealed itself. They were not simply people who had died and been forgotten. They were souls that had somehow been severed from the flow of time, existing in a state of limbo. Some were individuals whose lives had been overshadowed by war, tragedy, or injustice, their stories lost in the cracks of history. Others were those who had once wielded power, their names erased by the very forces they had once controlled. But there was something else. The book spoke of an ancient ritual, a curse that had been cast upon those who had crossed the boundaries of time. It was said that those who ventured too deep into the archive, who sought to uncover the forbidden knowledge buried within its walls, would risk becoming part of the archive itself, trapped between worlds, unable to move forward, unable to die. I closed the book with trembling hands, the weight of its words sinking into my chest. Was this Summer's fate? Had she ventured too deep, searching for answers that had cost her everything? Was she now one of the forgotten ones, doomed to wander the archive for eternity unless I could uncover the truth and break the curse? The idea seemed almost too much to bear. And yet, in the depths of my heart, I knew I had no choice but to continue. Summer had come to me for a reason, and I could feel that the time had come for me to unravel the truth. But how? I wandered through the archive, the corridors stretching endlessly before me. Each room I passed seemed to hold whispers, voices of the past calling out to me, beckoning me towards something I could not yet understand. And then, in the furthest corner of the archive, I saw her again. Summer stood in the shadows, her form flickering like a distant star, barely visible in the dim light. She was waiting for me. I took a step toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of the book, of the stories it had revealed, pressed down on me. I had to know. I had to ask. "Summer," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened to you? How did you become this? A ghost of the archive?" She stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw her clearly, really saw her. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and there was a weariness in her movements, as though she had been carrying the weight of the archive for centuries. She looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and longing, as though she were both a part of this place and yet not fully belonging to it. "It was never meant to be like this," she said softly, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "The archive was meant to preserve, to protect, to remember. But in its depths, something darker lives, something ancient and hungry. It calls to those who seek to uncover the past. It offers knowledge, but it takes so much more in return." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I could see the truth in them, the truth of what she had endured. "I was one of those who sought answers," she continued, her voice trembling. "I sought to understand the nature of time itself. I wanted to know why the past had been forgotten, why some stories never reached the light. But the more I uncovered, the more I began to see the dark heart of the archive. It consumed me, just as it consumes everyone who comes too close." The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. I took a step forward, wanting to reach out to her, to understand. "How do we stop it?" I asked, the desperation in my voice betraying the fear that had been growing inside me. She shook her head, a faint smile crossing her lips, though it was tinged with sadness. "I don't know, but there is one way to break free, one way to stop the archive from claiming any more lives." I waited, my breath held in anticipation. "You must remember," she whispered. "You must remember the forgotten ones. All of them. Their stories, their lives. Only then can the archive be made whole again. Only then can the curse be lifted." The silence that followed was deafening. Summer's figure flickered, and for a moment, I feared she would disappear again. But she stayed, her presence more real than ever. "Remember," she repeated, "and save us all." Chapter 9. Fragments of Truth. The weight of Summer's words hung heavy in the air, like a shadow that refused to fade. "Remember the forgotten ones. All of them. Their stories, their lives." Her voice echoed in my mind as I stood alone in the archive, surrounded by books that stretched endlessly into the darkness. Each tome, each fragment of parchment, seemed to hum with the same energy, the same urgency, as if the stories contained within were waiting to be remembered. I had always known the archive was a place of preservation, a sanctuary for stories that would otherwise be lost. But now, the very purpose of this place had changed. It was no longer just a collection of history. It was a living entity, a vast web of memories, each thread fragile and easily broken. The forgotten ones were not merely forgotten by the world. They were forgotten by time itself, suspended in the archive like dust particles caught in an endless current. And Summer, the ghost that haunted these halls, was one of them. I could still see her face, her sorrowful eyes, the longing in her voice. She had been trapped here, in this liminal space between the past and the present, because she had sought knowledge that was never meant to be found. And now, she was fading, her form becoming less substantial with each passing moment. But she had given me a task, a mission that could determine the fate of both the archive and the souls it housed. I had to remember. I had to seek out the stories of the forgotten ones and bring them back to life. The thought of it filled me with both dread and determination. How could I possibly uncover all of their stories? How could I remember all those who had been lost to time, whose names had never been recorded, whose lives had never been told? I knew the answer. There was only one way to begin. I turned and made my way down the familiar corridors of the archive, the soft echo of my footsteps reverberating off the stone walls. The shelves seemed to grow taller, stretching higher and higher as I walked deeper into the heart of the place. The further I went, the more it felt as though the archive itself were watching me, its countless stories pressing in from all sides. I reached a section of the archive I had never visited before. It was tucked away in a corner, hidden behind a set of heavy wooden doors that had long since fallen into disrepair. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. This room was different from the others. It felt older, more ancient, as though it had been sealed off from the rest of the archive for centuries. The shelves in this room were filled with scrolls and manuscripts, their edges frayed and their ink faded. Many of the texts were written in languages I could barely comprehend, their symbols foreign and strange. But something about them called to me, as if they held the key to the mysteries I sought to unravel. I reached for the nearest scroll and unrolled it carefully. The ink was barely visible, but the characters, though unfamiliar, seemed to shimmer on the page, as if they were alive, waiting to be read. I traced my fingers over the ancient text, trying to make sense of it, and a sudden vision flashed before my eyes. I saw a figure, a man, draped in the robes of an ancient order, standing at the edge of a great city. The city was burning, its towers collapsing into the earth as flames licked at the sky. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but his hands were raised, as if calling to something beyond the destruction. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. I staggered back, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Who was the man? And why had this vision come to me now? I looked back at the scroll, but the text seemed unchanged, its meaning still elusive. But I knew that this was a clue, a fragment of a story long forgotten. The man in the vision was one of the forgotten ones, a soul lost to time, whose story had never been told. I rolled the scroll back up and carefully returned it to the shelf, my hands shaking. I needed more answers. I needed to know who this man was, and what his story had to do with the archive. But more than that, I needed to understand how to break the curse that had trapped Summer, and countless others, within these walls. I turned to leave the room, but as I did, I felt a presence behind me. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it a faint whisper, a voice barely audible, but unmistakably familiar. "Remember," the voice said, and I spun around, heart racing. But there was no one there. Only the shelves, the dust, the forgotten texts. The voice was gone, but the command lingered, etched into my mind. I left the room quickly, my thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and urgency. The archive was vast, its secrets endless, but I could not afford to waste time. If I was to uncover the truth, I had to start somewhere, and the forgotten ones would be my guide. I spent the next several days in a fevered search, combing through the hidden corners of the archive, seeking out the stories of the lost souls that lingered within its walls. Each text, each manuscript, led me deeper into a world of forgotten history, of lives lived and lost, of names erased by time. Some of the stories were tragic, some were inspiring, but all of them were fragments of a past that had been swallowed by the tides of history. I began to see a pattern emerge. The forgotten ones were not all the same. Some had been forgotten because their lives had been deemed insignificant, their stories ignored by the world. Others had been forgotten because they had chosen to fade away, to erase their own names from the pages of history. And then there were those like Summer, souls who had crossed a forbidden threshold, seeking knowledge that had come at too high a price. But despite the diversity of their stories, there was one thing they all shared in common. They had all been forgotten by time, and as I read their tales, I began to feel their presence, as though they were watching me, urging me to remember them. One night, as I sat alone in the archive, Surrounded by open books and scattered pages, I felt it again, the chill of a presence near me. I looked up, and there, standing at the edge of the room, was Summer. Her form was faint, barely visible, but her eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with sorrow, now held something else. Hope. A flicker of something long buried, something that had been lost but was now beginning to awaken. "You're doing it," she said, her voice a soft, barely audible whisper. "You're remembering them. You're bringing them back." I nodded, my heart swelling with a mixture of relief and dread. The journey had only just begun. There were still so many stories to uncover, so many souls to remember. But I was not alone. Summer was with me, and the forgotten ones were waiting to be heard. And together, we would break the curse that had trapped them all. Chapter 10. The Crossroads of Time. The days blurred together as I continued my search through the archive. The air seemed to thicken with each passing hour, the weight of the forgotten ones pressing on me like a constant presence. Every story I uncovered, every name I whispered into the dark, only deepened the mystery. I felt as though I were standing at the edge of an abyss, peering into something vast and unknowable, yet I couldn't stop myself from looking. Summer was always there, lingering just beyond the periphery of my vision. Her form flickered like a fading star, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always watching, always waiting. I could feel her presence like a pull on my very soul, urging me forward, urging me to remember. But as I delved deeper into the archive, I began to sense something else as well, something darker, something ancient. The archive, it seemed, was alive in ways I hadn't fully understood. The stories I uncovered were more than mere records of the past. They were echoes, fragments of lives that had left their mark on the world, and now they were trapped, unable to move forward, unable to rest. Each time I read a new tale, I could feel the weight of the curse, the burden of forgotten souls who had been swept away by time and history. One evening, as I sat surrounded by open books, I heard it, a soft whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't Summer's voice this time. This was something else, something older, more sinister. The whisper came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from anywhere around me. It was coming from within the archive itself, from the very walls. The shelves groaned under the pressure of unseen forces, the air vibrating with an energy I couldn't understand. I stood, heart pounding, and moved toward the source of the sound. As I walked through the aisles, the whisper grew louder, more distinct, until it became a low hum, like the sound of something stirring in the depths of the archive. It was a sound that seemed to echo in my bones, resonating deep within me. I turned a corner and froze. There, at the center of the archive, was something I had never seen before. A door, hidden in the stone wall, its frame ancient and covered in vines of gold and silver that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. The door was unlike anything else in the archive. It was not part of the vast network of shelves and manuscripts. It stood alone, its presence commanding, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The hum grew louder as I approached, and the door seemed to beckon, drawing me toward it. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they touched the cool surface of the door. The moment my skin made contact, a jolt of energy shot through me, and a vision flashed before my eyes. I saw Summer again, but this time, she was not the pale, ethereal figure I had come to know. She was standing in a field of fire, her body radiant and full of life, her eyes blazing with a fierce light. She was calling out to me, her voice echoing in the vision. "Find the key," she whispered, her voice distant, as though carried on the wind. "The key is hidden in the stories. Only then can you unlock the door." The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I took a step back, my hand still resting on the door. The key. Summer had spoken of it before, but now I understood. The key was not a physical object. It was the story, the truth hidden in the archive. The one piece of knowledge that could break the curse and release the forgotten ones from their eternal prison. But where was the key? What was the story I needed to find? I stepped back, my mind racing. The door seemed to shimmer before me, its presence both inviting and forbidding. It was a gateway, a threshold between the known and the unknown, between the world of the living and the realm of the forgotten. And I had to cross it. I had to find the key and unlock the door, or the curse would claim me as well. I turned away from the door and hurried back to the farthest corner of the archive. The scrolls and books seemed to whisper at me as I passed, as though they, too, were aware of the impending choice I was about to make. I pulled the book from the shelf, the one that had first given me a glimpse of the forgotten ones, the one that spoke of the ancient ritual, the curse that trapped souls within the archive. As I flipped through the pages, my fingers brushed against something strange, a symbol, etched into the margin of one page. It was the same symbol I had seen in the vision, the same symbol that had appeared when summer had drawn in the air. I traced the symbol with my finger, and the room seemed to shift around me. The air grew colder, and the walls of the archive seemed to bend and twist, as though the very fabric of reality were warping under the weight of the mystery I was trying to solve. The book opened to a new section, one I hadn't seen before. The words were written in the same crimson ink, but this time they were clearer, more legible. The text described an ancient ritual, a ritual that had been used to bind the forgotten ones to the archive, to trap their stories in a place where time no longer moved. The ritual required a soul, a willing participant who would become the vessel for the lost memories. The person who performed the ritual would become the archivist, the keeper of the forgotten ones. The book also spoke of the consequences. The archivist, once chosen, could never leave the archive. Their soul would become intertwined with the stories they preserved, and they would be bound to the archive for eternity. The ritual was a curse, but it was also a gift. Those who became the archivist were granted the ability to remember, to see the stories of the forgotten ones and bring them back to life. But there was a dark twist. The ritual also bound the archivist to the archive in ways that no one could understand. The longer they stayed, the more their own memories would fade, their sense of self becoming lost in the vast sea of forgotten stories. In the end, the archivist would become a part of the archive itself, another soul trapped within its walls, another forgotten one. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. I understood now. I had been chosen, not because I had sought it, but because I had become part of the archive in ways I had never imagined. The moment I had stepped into this place, I had become its keeper, and now I had to choose whether I would remain as its archivist or whether I would break the curse and release the forgotten ones, including Summer, once and for all. But how could I make that choice? How could I walk away from everything I had become? I could feel the door behind me, its presence heavy and insistent. The key was within reach, but unlocking it meant sacrificing everything. I was the archivist. I had kept the stories for so long, but now it was time to decide whether I would remain a part of the archive forever or risk everything to free the souls trapped within it. And as I stood there, the whispers of the forgotten ones surrounding me, I realized one thing. I couldn't do it alone. Summer's voice had been the one constant in this journey, the only thread that had connected me to the truth. I needed her. I needed her to show me the way. And so, I made my decision. I would find the key. I would unlock the door. And I would free the forgotten ones, no matter the cost. Chapter 11. The Veil Lifts. The decision hung in the air like a fragile thread, trembling in the weight of its consequences. The choice I had made, to seek the key and unlock the door, was not one I had taken lightly. But even as I stood in the heart of the archive, My mind and soul pulled in different directions. I knew that there was no turning back. The door, that ancient portal, beckoned me with its silent promise, and I could feel its pull deep within me. But there was something else, too, a fear, a gnawing doubt that grew louder the closer I got to the door. The stories of the forgotten ones had consumed me. The names, the lives, the tragedies, and the joys that had been lost to time. Each one had left a mark on me. Each one had become a part of me. Could I truly sever myself from it all? Could I break free from the very thing that had shaped me into who I was now? The archive was more than just a place. It had become my identity, the essence of my being. And yet, it was not the only thing I had grown attached to. There was Summer. Her presence, once faint and elusive, had grown stronger over the past days. She had become my guide, my constant companion in this strange and disorienting journey. She was the one who had shown me the truth, the one who had urged me to remember the forgotten ones. And in the depths of the archive, amid the countless stories of lives lived and lost, I had come to understand something I hadn't realized before. Summer was not just a ghost. She was a part of the archive, as much a part of its stories as any of the souls it housed. She had once been like me, an archivist, but her search for knowledge had led her down a path from which there was no return. She had become trapped within these walls, a prisoner to the very stories she had sought to preserve. And now, she was fading. I had to do something. I had to save her. But how? The words she had spoken to me in the past few days echoed in my mind. Find the key. The key is hidden in the stories. Only then can you unlock the door. I had spent days searching for that key, piecing together fragments of forgotten histories, but I still hadn't found it. I had discovered so many secrets, so many hidden truths, but the key remained elusive, like a phantom just out of reach. It was then that I realized something I had missed before. The key was not just one story, one fragment of truth. The key was the sum of all the stories, the collective memories of the forgotten ones. Their lives, their choices, their pain and joy, they were all connected. The stories of the past were not separate from one another. They were woven together in an intricate tapestry, each thread a part of the whole. And the archive, in all its vastness, was the loom. I had been trying to piece together the key, but I hadn't been seeing the bigger picture. I had been treating each story as an isolated fragment, not realizing that they were all part of a greater whole. The key wasn't in any one story. It was in the stories themselves, in the very act of remembering them. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I understood now. The door, the gateway to the forgotten ones, was not something that could be unlocked by a single truth, a single key. It could only be opened when the stories themselves were fully realized, when the forgotten ones were no longer just names on a page, but living, breathing histories that were allowed to exist once more. I stood up, the weight of my realization settling over me. The archive, this place that had become my prison, could also be my salvation. I could remember the forgotten ones, not just by finding their stories, but by sharing them, by telling them. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding. The key was not a physical object, but the act of remembrance itself. I had to bring the stories to life, speak them aloud, let their voices echo through the archive, through the very fabric of time. Only then could the curse be broken. But there was something more I had to understand. The stories I had uncovered, were they truly just memories, or were they something else? Were they more than the past? The question lingered in my mind as I crossed the room toward the door. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the archive itself alive with anticipation. The whispering, once soft and distant, had grown louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to surround me. The forgotten ones, their stories rising up, calling out. I reached the door, and it shimmered before me, the golden vines glowing brighter as I approached. My hand hovered over the handle, but before I could touch it, a voice echoed through the room. Summer's voice. "Remember," she whispered, her tone urgent. "The stories are not just memories. They are the future. They are the threads that bind us all. Don't let them slip away." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I could feel the weight of her words, the depth of her plea. The forgotten ones were not just trapped in the past. They were a part of the present, a part of me, a part of the world. Their stories had to be told, not just to free them, but to free myself as well. I opened my eyes and grasped the handle of the door. It was time. As I turned the handle, the door creaked open, revealing a blinding light that seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of the archive. The voices of the forgotten ones grew louder, filling my ears with their stories, their cries, their joys, their pain. I stepped forward, into the light, and the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a shift, an unraveling of time itself. The archive was no longer just a place of stories. It was a living, breathing entity, a nexus between the past, the present, and the future. The stories were no longer trapped. They were alive, flowing freely, intertwining with the very fabric of existence. Summer appeared before me, her form glowing brighter than ever. She smiled, a look of peace and gratitude in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You found the key. You unlocked the door." And in that moment, I understood. The curse was broken. The forgotten ones were no longer trapped in the archive. They were free, their stories no longer lost to time. And I was no longer just an archivist. I was a part of the stories themselves, a part of the tapestry of history, a living testament to the power of memory. As the light enveloped me, I realized something else. The archive had never been a prison. It had been a sanctuary, a place where the stories of the forgotten ones could be preserved, waiting for someone to remember them, to bring them to life. And now, it was no longer a place of sorrow and loss. It was a place of connection, of understanding. I had become a part of the archive, but in doing so, I had set it free. Chapter 12, A Flicker of Light. The world beyond the door was not what I had expected. I had imagined light, freedom, release, but what I found was an endless expanse, like the horizon stretched far beyond sight. There were no walls, no boundaries, only the infinite. It was as though I had stepped into the very pulse of the archive itself, a place where time, space, and memory converged into something boundless, something eternal. Summer stood before me, her figure still glowing with that otherworldly light. She was no longer the faint shadow I had first encountered, no longer just a fragment of memory or ghostly echo. She was solid now, her form alive with energy, with purpose. She smiled at me, a smile filled with gratitude. But there was something else in her eyes, something deeper, more knowing. "We're free," she said, her voice a soft melody that seemed to carry with it the weight of all the stories we had uncovered. "We are free, but you are the key. You have done more than break the curse. You have rewritten everything." I stared at her, still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. The door had opened, yes, but I hadn't expected to step into this realm. This place where all stories existed simultaneously, where the past, present, and future were inextricably intertwined. "Rewritten everything?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in this vast space. "What do you mean? I thought we were just breaking the curse." Summer stepped closer, her presence comforting, but also stirring something deep within me, something that felt like both relief and fear. She reached out, placing a hand on my arm, and I felt the weight of her touch. "The curse was never just about the forgotten ones," she said softly. "It was about the very nature of memory, about what happens when stories are lost and left untold. What you did wasn't just a release. It was a restoration. You've unlocked the stories, yes, but you've also unlocked the very essence of time itself. I blinked, trying to absorb her words. Essence of time? Summer nodded. You've brought the stories back into the flow of time. You've reconnected them to the world, to the living, the forgotten ones. They are not just memories now. They are part of the now. They can be remembered, they can be told, and they can change the future. The archive was never meant to be a prison. It was always meant to preserve the stories, to allow them to be carried forward. But it got lost. We got lost. I took a slow breath. The weight of her words sank in. The archive was not just a repository of the past. It was a living, breathing part of the world, and I had been its keeper. I had always known there was more to the archive than I had understood. But now, standing here with Summer, I realized how little I had truly known about the nature of memory, of history, and of the very act of telling stories. You're saying that by unlocking the archive, by bringing the forgotten ones back into time, I faltered, trying to find the right words. I've changed everything? Yes, Summer said, her smile softening. In a way, you've made the past and the future one. You've created a bridge between them, so that the stories can live and breathe in the present. They are not lost anymore, and neither are we. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The uncertainty, the fear that had gnawed at me for so long, seemed to fade in the face of this truth. I had freed the forgotten ones. I had done it, but in doing so, I had not only broken the curse, I had given them a place in the world once more. But then, a deeper realization struck me. And what about me? I asked quietly, what happens to me now? Summer's expression grew solemn. You have a choice now. You can stay here, in this realm, where the stories live forever. Or you can return to the world you knew. You can walk among the living, but you'll be different. You'll carry the stories with you, always. You'll remember the forgotten ones as if they were your own memories. I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The archive had been my home for so long. I had lost touch with what the world outside even felt like. And now, it was all too much. The thought of walking back into the world of the living seemed impossible, almost suffocating. But at the same time, the thought of staying here, of losing myself in the stories forever, felt equally daunting. What happens if I stay? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Then you will be one of them, Summer said gently. You'll become a part of the archive, another story to be told. You'll be remembered, but you won't live the way you once did. You will be like the others, a fragment in time, a memory that never fades. You'll be immortal, but you will never truly be alive. I shuddered at the thought. And if I leave? If you leave, she said softly, you will return to the world of the living. You will be part of time again, but it won't be the same. You will carry the weight of the stories with you. You will remember them all, and you will never forget. You will be a keeper, a guardian of the past and the future. The choice loomed before me, vast and consuming. On one hand, there was the world of the living, with its fleeting moments and inevitable losses. On the other hand, there was the archive, where stories lived on forever, untouched by time, but at the cost of my own humanity. Summer, I said, my voice trembling, how do I know what's right? How do I know what to choose? She smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. You already know, archivist. You've always known. I closed my eyes, taking in her words. She was right. I did know. The archive had been my sanctuary, my prison, and my salvation. It had shaped me into who I was. But I wasn't just a keeper of stories. I was part of those stories, and they were part of me. The question was no longer about where I belonged. It was about who I had become. I opened my eyes, feeling a quiet resolve settle in my chest. I choose to remember, I said softly, my voice steady. I choose to carry the stories with me. I choose to live with them, and to make sure they're never forgotten again. Summer's smile widened, and I could see the light in her eyes soften, the gratitude she had for me shimmering like a distant star. Then go, she said gently. Go and live. Carry the stories with you, and never let them fade. And know that no matter where you go, you will always be a part of the archive. You will always be remembered. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into me. The archive had given me everything: knowledge, stories, memories. But it was time for me to step back into the world. It was time for me to live, to carry the stories forward. And so, as I turned to leave this place of memory and time, I knew that I was no longer just the archivist. I was something more. I was the keeper of the forgotten, the guardian of the past, and the bridge between what was and what could be. The world awaited, and I was ready to remember. Chapter 13. The Open Door. The world outside the archive felt alien, almost as if it were a dream. I stepped through the threshold, leaving behind the realm where stories were eternal and time folded in on itself. It was a place where the forgotten ones had lingered, their memories imprisoned in the silence of the archive. But now, they were free. And so was I. The world I had returned to was tangible, yet it seemed so fragile compared to the vast expanse I had just left. The air felt different here, thick with the weight of things left unsaid, of time that had slipped by unnoticed. The buildings, the streets, the people, they were all the same, but somehow different, as though the years I had spent within the archive had altered my perception of them. I looked up at the sky, trying to steady my breathing. It was a pale blue, almost gray, as if it, too, was holding its breath. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The city had the quiet stillness of an early morning before the world woke up. It was as though everything was waiting for something to happen, something that had been long overdue. And then I remembered. The stories. They were no longer lost. They were alive, woven into the fabric of this world, waiting to be told. I felt the pull of them, deep inside me. Their voices, quiet but insistent, whispered in the back of my mind. They were not gone. They were with me. Always. But what did it mean to carry them? I began walking, my footsteps slow at first, as I tried to absorb everything around me. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the faint chatter of pedestrians, were both comforting and disorienting. It was as if I had stepped out of one world and into another, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. I passed a cafe, its windows fogged from the heat inside. The scent of fresh coffee and baked bread wafted out, a reminder of the simple pleasures I had long since forgotten. I paused for a moment, watching the people inside through the glass. They were laughing, talking, living in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. The world had continued without me, and I wondered if it would ever be the same again. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly, and a few heads turned in my direction. I glanced around at the patrons, some lost in conversation, others absorbed in their own thoughts, and felt a strange sense of isolation. How could I explain to them the weight of what I had just experienced? How could I tell them that the world they inhabited was not all there was? Can I help you? The barista's voice broke through my reverie. She was young, with dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her apron adorned with a faded logo. She smiled at me, her eyes kind but distant. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have a coffee," I said, my voice sounding unfamiliar, like I was speaking from a place far removed from this reality. She nodded and turned to prepare my order, leaving me standing there, lost in thought. I took a seat by the window, gazing out at the city as it carried on around me. The sun had dipped lower now, casting a golden glow across the buildings. The air felt warmer, more alive. It was a fleeting moment of peace, one I was unsure how to hold on to. The coffee arrived a few moments later, and I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, savoring the heat as it seeped into my fingers. It was comforting, familiar, but even as I drank it, I could feel the stories pressing at the edges of my mind, clamoring for attention. They were waiting for me to remember, to speak them aloud, to carry them forward into the world. The truth was, I had no idea where to begin. The stories were endless. They were not confined to the archive, not confined to the past. They were alive, intertwined with the present and the future, and they existed in every corner of the world. They were in the conversations I overheard, the people I passed on the street, the faces I would never know. I could feel the weight of their lives, their choices, their joys and sorrows, pressing against me, demanding to be acknowledged. They were no longer confined to the pages of forgotten books. They were a part of the living world now, and I was the keeper of them. I was the one who had to make sure they were remembered. But how could I carry that burden? As I sat there, the world outside bustling with life, I felt something shift within me. A quiet resolve, a new understanding. The stories were not just mine to carry. They were meant to be shared, to be told, to be passed on. They were not meant to be hidden away, to be kept locked in the dark corners of forgotten archives. They were meant to be spoken aloud, to be heard by the living, so that the past could shape the future. I stood up suddenly, the weight of the realization settling over me. The world was waiting for the stories, waiting for them to be told. It wasn't enough to simply remember them. I had to bring them to life. I paid for the coffee and left the cafe, stepping back into the street. The air was cooler now, the evening settling in. The city was alive with activity, but there was an underlying current of something deeper, something older, something that connected all of us. The stories were here, in this place, waiting to be heard. I began walking again, my steps quicker now, as though I were being drawn forward by something invisible, something urgent. The faces I passed seemed to watch me, as if they knew what I carried with me. They were part of the story too. Each person I encountered was a thread in the tapestry of time. Each one had a story to tell, a story that was waiting to be heard. I reached a small park, its benches empty and its paths quiet. The trees rustled softly in the breeze, and the distant sound of a child's laughter echoed through the space. I paused for a moment, taking in the serenity of the park, but the stories within me wouldn't let me stay still for long. They were growing louder, more insistent, demanding to be shared. I sat down on one of the benches, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to find the words. The past and the future were alive within me now, tangled together in a web of memories and possibilities. I had to begin somewhere, but where? The answer came to me slowly, as though it were a whisper from the past, a murmur from the forgotten ones themselves. I began to speak, my voice soft at first, but growing stronger with each word. I spoke of the lives that had come before me, of the choices that had shaped the world, of the people who had lived and died, leaving their stories behind. I spoke of summer, of the archivist, of the curse that had bound us all. And with each word, the weight on my chest lightened, as if the stories themselves were lifting me up, guiding me forward. And as I spoke, I realized something. The stories were not just a burden. They were a gift to be shared, to be passed on, to be woven into the fabric of the world. I was no longer just an archivist. I was a storyteller, a keeper of the past, a bridge between what was and what could be. The weight of time was no longer something that crushed me. It was something that shaped me, something that guided me forward. The past was no longer a prison. It was a doorway that I had opened and through which I would walk, carrying the stories with me into the world of the living. And so, as the night settled in around me, I continued to speak. I spoke for the forgotten ones. I spoke for the lost stories. And I spoke for the future, for the world that was waiting to hear them. The weight of time was no longer a burden. It was my calling.